And so some of the reading rights that they come up with are the simple things that we so quickly remove, right? Choice, the right to not share, the right to read at a comfortable pace rather than being rushed through books, right? The right to not feel judged by the choices that they make. The right to abandon a book if it doesn't work and then be reinvited into another journey. I mean, it's the same thing that we as adults love when we see ourselves as readers, and yet we so often remove those very basic rights from kids.
Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. This month, the Global Read Aloud started its 11th year. The premise of the Global Read Aloud is pretty simple. Classrooms around the world read the same book for 6 weeks and look for ways to make connections with each other. The premise is simple, but the impact has been profound, with over 1 million students taking part, book authors getting involved, and the project continues to expand. The founder of the Global Read Aloud is my guest on the show today.
My name is Pernille Ripp, and normally you can find me surrounded by 7th graders in my English classroom in Oregon, Wisconsin. I am originally from Denmark, born and raised, but made it to the United States and became a teacher in the American public school system. Since 2010, I have written and shared about my practice around the world. I travel and train and coach other educators to think about how we can create more passionate literacy environments, as well as increase student engagement by giving back the space to students. And since 2010, I have also been the founder of the Global Read Aloud, a global literacy program whose goal is really just to connect the world through Read Aloud, and has connected millions of students around the world through the shared Read Alouds, and kicks off on October 4th this year and will then run for 6 weeks. So lots of things to do, but mostly I'm just a teacher and a mom trying to figure it all out.
If you're an English teacher, or maybe you just love books, or you have a child who's in those formative reading years, this episode's for you. I love talking about books and reading, and I was so impressed with the way Pernille describes her classroom, with clarity, empathy, and purpose. We discussed how she creates a culture of reading in her classroom, why school has a tendency to make students dislike books, and of course, the Global Read Aloud. I started our conversation by asking her, what does it mean to be a reader?
I think for me, reading has always been a safe space. It hasn't always presented safety, though. I think reading can be seen as something relaxing, but also as an incredible amount of work. But for me, reading has always been an invitation into the lives of others and to learn more about the world and stoke that curiosity that fuels me as an educator and as a human being anyway. I was just thinking about it as I woke and continued to catch up on the news coming out of Afghanistan this morning, and thinking about whose stories do we have represented in our classroom library to really bring home the humanitarian crisis that is now happening in Afghanistan for my students, and also to get them to connect with the humanity aspect of it overall. And so that's what I use reading for a lot, is just to think about, what don't I know, and what would I like to know more about, and how can I enter into the worlds of other people, especially in places where I might not travel or speak to people who live that experience. And so for me, the type of reading we try to do in our classroom also reflects that, to create safety for kids. But that also needs to then recognize that for some of my students, and sometimes the majority of my students, reading is not anything pleasurable or joyful, and that there needs to be space made for those emotions that they carry with reading, and try to figure out where they are on their reading journey, and how can we get them to find value in reading without seeing it as something that harms them or brings up really negative experiences in their life.
Yeah, I've noticed in your writing and in your tweets, inclusion is a very common word that you use. How does inclusivity fit into reading and books? What's the sort of the connection there?
Well, I'm reminded of the words of Chad Everett, who's a brilliant thinker and president of a school down in Mississippi, and how he speaks about how we don't know the lives of others or the identities that they carry. And so I don't know what someone needs in order to be reflected within a book. I can look at surely their physical identity markers and assume what they might want to see in a book, but I don't know about their inner lives and inner workings unless they let me in. And so when I think about inclusion, I really think about making sure that every child and an adult as well that enters into our classroom space and into our reading opportunities is offered a chance to connect potentially with a piece of their identity, whether it's known or not known. And so I think that that's just so important. I'm constantly reflecting upon my own reading life as far as going, whose stories am I gravitating more towards, and how is that limiting my perspective of the world? And then whose stories do I need to include in order to broaden my own thinking? And so that's work that I introduce and continue with my students as well, of just thinking about, because we are so shaped by the media that we consume, that I want them to think about how they're being shaped by the reading choices that they do or don't make.
And you mentioned that some students have a complex relationship with reading, which I think is sometimes hard for readers to understand. If you're a natural reader, someone who gravitates towards books, you don't often consider that not everyone feels that way. And we're recording this a couple weeks before school begins. What does the beginning of the school year look like in your classroom? And how do you introduce reading? How do you lay the groundwork for a year of literacy?
I think it is all about recognizing the human beings that are entering into our space and giving us genuine opportunities to get to know one another that feels safe in the capacity that children need, and also invites them to share whatever they feel comfortable with. And that includes our reading too. I was just sitting late last night planning for the second day of school. And the second day of school is where we really start to dive into the foundation of our reading growth and reading journey for the year. And that starts with inviting kids to think about, when has reading not been a good experience for them in their life versus when has it? And hired reflections. Kids do it on post-it notes. Last year with virtual, we did it on Padlets. And then stepping back as a community and going, what do you notice between all of these answers? And kids are always struck by how many kids feel the same way they do, and the validation that comes with that. And then also it allows us to start a conversation about, okay, I hear you and I see you. I see these experiences that you've shared where reading has become something harmful to you, or something that you have actively tried to not do and maybe spend a lot of time running from. And so here are some things that I can put in place in our classroom spaces, but also, what do I need for you to feel like maybe you can dip your toes back into this journey that you're on? And recognizing that all of the kids that walk through our spaces are readers, even if they don't see it yet themselves. And so a lot of that just comes down to a lot of conversations after they've done kind of this post-it, why does reading suck? When is reading magical? Whatever they want to call it. Then they create their reading rights. And it really becomes the foundation of the experiences that we try to co-create. That these rights are the things that they need to feel safe to get back on or to continue on their reading journey. And we take that very seriously. And it's fascinating. I've been doing this particular work, oh gosh, 8 or 9 years now, probably. And it's the same things that come up every single year that kids are hoping for. And when I think about, when I do this work with adults, it's like the realization that these are the same things that we long for as adults. And so some of the reading rights that they come up with are the simple things that we so quickly remove, right? Choice, the right to not share, the right to read at a comfortable pace rather than being rushed through books, right? The right to not feel judged by the choices that they make. The right to abandon a book if it doesn't work and then be reinvited into another journey. I mean, it's the same thing that we as adults love when we see ourselves as readers, and yet we so often remove those very basic rights from kids.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme as educators. It's the things that we do in our adult life, and yet somehow schools, we put up artificial barriers sometimes that don't reflect that. Um, a bit about the role of reflection in reading. I know you've done a lot of work. You mentioned having kids reflect in Padlet during the pandemic learning, and I know you've done work on digital notebooks and reading notebooks. What is the proper balance and role of reflection in reading, where students still get to immerse themselves in a book, but also have that space to reflect and write when necessary without it being cumbersome to the point where it actually takes away from the book.
So a lot of the reflection work that I do is actually them reflecting on their own reading journey. So it's outside, it's not necessarily tied to the book that they're currently reading, because I want them to sit down and go, who am I as a reader? Where am I on my journey? And what might my next step be? Because one of the things that I hear every single year from students, why they hate reading, is because of what we make them do with the reading after. And I remember this year, moving from fifth to seventh, I had my student just a quick 4-minute reflection every time they read. And they had like 70 questions that they could choose from. And I think it took 2 weeks, and my class was in mutiny, right? They were like, this is awful, Mrs. Ripp. You're making us not want to do the reading because we hate the 4 minutes. And I was like, it's only 4 minutes. And they were like, do it yourself. Try it yourself. How do you feel about just picking one of these questions? And I think about that when we as adults often sit down with a book that has moved us in some way, whether it's to deeper thought or really shook our core in some way, we don't seek out paper most of the time. Most of the time, we seek out human connection. We want to sit and talk about it. We want to sit with someone who's going to make space and keep our words safe. And so I talk about that with my students, that sometimes you are going to have to reflect on what you're reading and be able to write about it. And also because, there are policies in place that say you have to be able to do this on a state test, and that, I need to also make sure that you can do that so that you can go on the path of success that you want to achieve. But there's a balance between it. There's a balance between writing about something and also just sitting and discussing with someone, or maybe recording, or maybe drawing. And then thinking about what is the core of what we're trying to get kids to do. And I think about, well, for me, I would much rather see them make those human connections and go, okay, how is this impacting me as a human being? And I teach seventh graders, so sometimes they're like, it doesn't, I don't connect to it at all. They're like, I don't know what this is. Okay, what doesn't connect to it, right? Like, how does this speak to you as far as you go and no, this is not my life at all. Like, let's talk about the juxtaposition between that. And so I think one of the things that I've really wanted to consider as I move into this new year, and we're starting, in with students face to face 5 days a week, which I haven't done since March 13th, 2020, will be fully masked, thankfully. Is I want to make as much space as I can for student voices, because there was so much writing last year being behind computers, and so many kids who didn't feel secure or safe in sharing their voices. And I don't blame them. I think it's really hard to speak on camera in front of others. And so I really want to bring it back to discussion. So I think the biggest thing that I tell educators is, talk to your students. How do they feel about the balance between reading and the work of reading afterwards? And if you see that impacting them negatively, then talk about what can we do instead.
And I've often found in my own life that if I read a particularly impactful book, it doesn't, I don't fully understand it, or I haven't fully processed it till much later. Or maybe I read something else and I'm making connections. And I think sometimes in schools we say, okay, you just read that chapter, write about it right now. And we're not giving them that space and time. Yeah. What was your own reading journey like as a student and as you grew into adulthood?
Um, so growing up in the Danish educational system, we don't have classroom libraries. There are no, at least not when I grew up. I still don't think they're super common. There wasn't really like read aloud, like all the things when we sit in the US and think about the reading journey of children, right? We think of story time and classroom library collections if we have the money to do it, and read alouds and book clubs. That was not my reading experience growing up, but it didn't matter because I had my mom, and my mom flooded us with reading materials. My mom is an English professor, and we had comics and any book we wanted to read. And I had a public library with librarians who welcomed me in with open arms and didn't say, "Here's the children's section," right? They said, "Just bring it back. Whatever it is you grab, just bring it back." And we were given the space to develop as readers. And so reading was just always a constant. I remember even going, my parents were split up when I was young, and like going to my dad's house, like he would also have a read aloud for us. And he would also have books for us. And we also had a library card in his city, right? So that we could go to the library. And so I lived a privileged childhood in that way. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had books. And I was allowed to read whatever I wanted. And no one ever came in and said I had to prove it. And I remember distinctly in school that wasn't the experience at all. And yet I still made it as a reader. But then coming into the American public school system, where story is really at the heart of what we do, particularly with young children, it was fascinating to see then how quickly we also expect kids to just have it figured out and have that independent reading life figured out. Really, by third grade, we're kind of like, okay, we did all the magic. You should now be on your reading journey. You should now have found value within reading. So we're now going to assume that you're going to continue to do all this work outside of school. And yet that's not what happens for many kids, either by choice or circumstance. And so that's something that I've really had to sit with in my own space, like you even mentioned, right? Like, how often do we take that away from kids despite what we know about ourselves? How often do we try to model kids' reading journeys after our own? Not recognizing that we may have similarities, but we'll never be on the same path. And so we really need to make space for all the different reading journeys for kids, and also help kids realize that even if in seventh grade or 12th grade, if they still don't see themselves as readers, that doesn't mean that they can't become a reader, and to continue to have that hope of finding connections within text or whatever media they're consuming.
Yeah, and by fourth, fifth grade, so often there's so much content in our curriculums, and it starts to rob us of that reading time. I love your description of being a child in the library and just pick out whatever you want and bring it back. How do you help? How much do you help students choose books in your classroom? What's that look like when a student is trying to find the right book? Where do you come into that process?
I think it's been super fascinating to dive into that more with students, because I definitely was the teacher when a kid would come to me and say, "Oh, I don't like reading." And my rote answer was, "Oh, you just haven't met the right book yet." And now I know what a dismissal of their reading journey that is, because maybe that child met the right book 5 years ago and has not been able to replicate that feeling. Maybe they've tried for years and feel like they are failing, right? Like they somehow haven't cracked the code of finding a right book. So now it looks like gentle conversation, hopefully questions that will help them uncover what they're searching for as far as their reading experience. And it goes way beyond, oh, you liked this fantasy book, so here's another fantasy book. Like really thinking about, like, okay, when you come to me and you say, I love Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which so many students do. Okay, what about it? Like, is it the development of the character? Is it the balance between images and text? Like, what is it that drew you in and kept you there? And that's been an interesting journey, because a lot of my students don't always have the answers. They don't know. They don't know what it was that they liked about that book, or even they don't know why they didn't like the book that they tried. And so for me, book shopping is such a huge all year thing that they're constantly developing. And I'm sure they get sick of it. I'm sure, at times they're like, Mrs. Rip, just give me like a stack of books and like stop with all the questions. But I don't want them to have to be reliant on me when they leave. I want them to be able to go into any book environment and go, oh, I know myself as a reader, and therefore I can go in these directions. And that goes way beyond any kind of artificial measures I can put into place. And so it's a lot of conversation, it's a lot of trial and error. And it's a lot of celebration too, of like when a child abandons book after book after book, going, okay, good. Like those are choices that you knew didn't work for you. Why? When in the book did you decide this was not a fit? Like, what is it that made you lose interest? Let's talk about that and then apply that like grain of knowledge to how we select the next book. And then also just getting the community involved. So it's not always Mrs. Rip will bookshop with you. Obviously we have an incredible librarian who will also do it, but also thinking about like, how are we utilizing the peers in the classroom? Who are your book people in this classroom? And I think that's really important.
And that's some pretty high level skills you're describing. Really, metacognition, thinking about your reading, collaboration. What's a book that makes a frequent appearance in your classroom, either because students pick it up or maybe it's a mentor text? What's one book you could name right now that just seems to always be in Ms. Rip's class?
Oh, so it was super fascinating last year. I think the pandemic really changed reading habits for kids, and it'll be interesting to see if it's permanently or not. And a lot of the books that normally I can't keep on the shelves were not getting discovered. And instead, what was being discovered were really kind of like lighter reads, both shorter but also topic wise, which makes sense, right? The world feels really heavy. So pre-pandemic, I would have told you books like Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds has converted so many students. I think anything by Jason Reynolds has converted so many of my kids who didn't find a place within reading to become readers. Scythe series by Neil Shusterman has really hooked some of my students into longer fantasy dystopian, more mature topics. I also think about anything by Nick Stone or Nicola Yoon or Jenny Han. P.S. I Still Love You, like To All the Boys I've Loved Before, has really brought a lot of my kids back into reading. Last year, it was a lot, again, of just graphic novels, a lot of free verse. Starfish by Lisa Phipps was a huge book in our classroom. And a lot of kids, no matter where they fell on the gender spectrum, came to me and really said they felt very connected to that book. Also, anything that had to do with with history, but in a more digestible way. So it'll be interesting to see, because of course I've created my back to school reading displays and really tried to have a lot of enticing books out. But it'll be interesting to see with this group of kids, who have now been living through, as all of us have, this COVID pandemic for so long, how that will permanently alter the reading choices that kids grab onto this year.
I love the diversity in all the books that you just named, and I totally agree about there's a bit of escapism in what kids were reading. I know over here it was Lee Bardugo's Crooked Kingdom and Six of Crows, and oh, they were so popular, and I loved them. And there was just a beautiful escapism, that sort of high fantasy, get me away from the heaviness of reality. You talk about kind of working through books and thinking really carefully about selecting books. And now would be a good time to maybe segue over to the global read aloud, where you have to think very, very carefully about book selection. Maybe just introduce my readers to how you started this over a decade ago, I think, and sort of how it's evolved over time.
So Global Read Aloud started in 2010 for purely selfish reasons, right? Like I wanted to introduce more connections to my fourth graders at the time, and I wanted to integrate technology in meaningful ways without it being just like a show pony. And so I kept circling back to this idea of a read aloud, and driving in the car, listening to NPR. They mentioned Neil Gaiman. I love Neil Gaiman. So I turned it up, and on Twitter that summer, and I had just gotten on Twitter myself, there was people were reading American Gods as a global book club and using a common hashtag to share their reading. And I was so fascinated by that idea. And I turned to my husband and I said, someone should do that for kids. And he was like, well, why don't you? He says that actually never happened. I swear the conversation happened. And so that's how it started. I went back and I was like, what if I selected a text that we were going to read aloud and just asked other classrooms to perhaps read it at the same time? And then we could have some natural conversations that would start within the book, but go beyond the book, because really the book just offers as a way to get over the initial awkwardness of like connecting with strangers. And because I know I have felt so connected to people I've never met, if you tell me like your top 5 books, we already have like a connection. If those are books that I have also loved, right? Like it's like books stop you from being strangers. And so that's really what it was. That first year was one book. We did The Little Prince, which had a lot of meaning for me from my childhood. And people signed up. I put it out on Twitter and on a blog post and was kind of like, how about this global read aloud idea? We can use a wiki to connect, because that was the height of wikis. And some people who followed me, who had a lot more followers than I did, retweeted it. And so it was a very organic process right away. People were like, sounds good. Where do we sign up? I don't know. Everything was just like, okay, I'll figure out how we're going to sign up. I'll figure out how we're going to share. And then we did it, and we did it for 4 weeks, and it was fantastic seeing my 4th graders create drawings from The Little Prince and have discussions. And I think I even like recorded myself doing one of the read alouds in my space and like shared that out. It was just very organic, homegrown, and it was great. And my students loved it. They couldn't believe that kids in other parts of North America were having the same thoughts that they were. And it was that similarity that really hooked us, because I had always thought about it, oh, here will be an opportunity to talk about our differences. Look at how different we are sitting. But really what it came down to was, look at how similar we are. Even though our school spaces look totally different, maybe our daily lives look totally different, maybe we look totally different, but we're so similar because we're sitting with the same thoughts. And it ended, and right away the educators who had who had signed up, they were like, let's do it again. And I was like, what? No, way too much work. And they were like, well, how about we make it a yearly thing? And I was like, yeah, I can get behind that. And so then it just kind of, again, continued this organic growth. The next year it was 2 books just to get a little bit more span. And then the third year we really expanded to what it is now, where it's there's a picture book author study or illustrator study, depending on the year. This year it's Duncan Tunatui, who's incredible, one of my favorite picture book creators. And anyone can do the picture books. You decide whatever book you want to do. And then there's 4 different text selections, kind of spanning that kindergarten through 12th grade. And people choose the books that work for them. It's free, of course. You do have to get your own books, because otherwise my husband would kill me if I was sending books around the world. And sometimes the authors get involved when they have space for it in their lives, which is really incredible. And then you just make it work for you. You basically, when you join the Facebook group or check in on the hashtag or go to the blog, because you don't really have to sign up anywhere anymore, you just commit to reading the book aloud. And there's not a lot of wrong ways to do the global read aloud, which is what I love about it. It can feel really unmanageable for newbies, but there are so many veterans that have done it before, that if someone is thinking about joining, I would say join the Facebook group. Even though I have a very big hate love relationship with Facebook, it has worked really well for the global read aloud. And then if you want, find someone to connect with. There's lots of people looking for connections. Um, and then you can decide, like, do you want to just read it aloud, knowing that thousands and thousands, sometimes millions of kids are also listening to the same read aloud? Or do you want to create some sort of shared experience, whether it's with one other class or with many other classrooms? And there's all sorts of ways to do that. We have people who do postcards and letters and community service programs, but we also have people who are like, we're going to do a Kahoot one week, or we're going to do a Flipgrid, or we're going to just send something out in the world but not really connect with one people or one class. And I think that that's the beauty of the program, is that you don't have to be super tech savvy. You don't have to commit to more than what you can do. And the books are always like tied in with standards, as far as like they can work for anywhere. I use it as my mentor text for when we enter into reading work. And so it's meant to be a way to bring the world into your space in a manageable way, and it has succeeded in doing that for millions of classrooms, which is crazy. And had I known that it would be this thing, I wouldn't have done it, because I would have thought that surely somebody else who would be better at running a global project should run it. And so sometimes I guess we just got to jump in with both feet and see where it goes.
Absolutely. And congratulations on the success with the Global Read Aloud. And you mentioned how you use it when introducing mentor texts. And I've heard you say that the Global Read Aloud should be thought of as part of what teachers do, not something else. And I really appreciated that comment, because so often at schools, we just start layering things on top of each other instead of removing things. And I just kind of want to reiterate that point, that how can teachers take the GRA and make it just organically part of their everyday instruction?
Well, I think like if you're looking to get started, and we already know that this year will be unpredictable. A good place to start, honestly, is the picture book author study, because it's just one picture book a week for those 6 weeks. And so maybe you just look at the book selected by Duncan, and you go, okay, we're going to use this as a mentor text this week. We're going to study writer's craft, or or whatever it is we want. Maybe we want to, some of them are biography texts, so maybe we want to use it to learn about someone, or maybe we want to do a writing exercise off of the book or something like that. But maybe just dabbling your feet in. And then I think also being okay with, so the project is set to run 6 weeks, but I don't think I've ever finished it within 6 weeks. So I think it's also okay to recognize and go, you know what, my timeline's going to have to be a little bit different. Also, because some schools have vacation in the middle of that 6 week period, or something happens, right? I mean, obviously with COVID, lots of things can happen. So I think it's also going into the project and just saying, you know what, I'm going to try in the capacity that I have and see where I can fit it in naturally. Can I use this read aloud as a substitute for the mentor text I was going to use either way? Can it just be a read aloud that we sit and share in, and maybe it's not something that we do a massive thing with, you know, finding a way to give it space without it feeling overwhelming, I think is so important. And I think the people who come back year after year, and we have educators who have done it every single year. You know, this is like the part of their, and I'm so grateful for them because they have been the biggest welcoming ambassadors I could ever ask for, and they do amazing things. But they've said too, you know, depending on their year, they just change what they do in order to make it sustainable. And I think we need to trust our guts too, that the minute something feels like it's too much, back off. Like, what part of it can you use? What part of it will work to make it a more pleasurable reading experience? And it's also okay to say, you know what, this year, I'm going to maybe do it later in the year and just use some of the resources shared because it's not going to fit in for me right at that time. And so I just want to let people know that there's so many ways to do it that should never feel overwhelming or unsustainable, or bring you, I don't know, feelings of panic.
What's been your favorite book in this past decade? Either because the book spoke to you personally, or maybe it got the strongest, best, most profound reaction from teachers and students.
I can't, I, there's so many different books.
Maybe unfair question.
It's super unfair because there's like, I think about like The One and Only Ivan, for example. Um, I had never read it. I selected it because people had suggested it so many times, and I was like, okay, sounds good. And then I read it and I was like, oh my gosh, this book is amazing. And then it won the Newbery the same year after we had done it. And it was also Catherine Applegate, who was the very first author who connected with me and said, hey, I see you're doing this with my book. How can I support it? So like The One and Only Ivan has this very special spot as far as like first author involvement, and also the fact that like we randomly picked the Newbery winner before it was the Newbery winner. And then of course the power of the book, right? The book is so incredible. So like that book has this incredibly special place for me. But I also think of like the picture book author study of Amy Krauss Rosenthal. When she was selected, her and I were going back and forth, and then she was diagnosed with cancer in the middle of it. And so all of her plans um, shifted to her personal assistant. And her personal assistant was like, Amy still wants to do it, but she is going through treatment. So like any of the stuff that was going to be like Amy making videos became Amy not in the video, but Amy's idea. And um, she made all these incredible celebrations. And just like when the news broke that she had passed, I was in my classroom and I happened to jump on Twitter during lunch and it came out, and I was bawling in my classroom in front of my seventh graders by the time they walked in, because I was like, the world has lost such an incredible light. Because that's what she brought to the global Rita Light, this incredible sense of play and whimsy, and just saw this like random little project from this person, you know, coming from Denmark as something really magical, as a way to connect people. But I also think about some of the really hard conversations that have come from the global Read Aloud about connecting kids with stories where they somehow had disconnected from the humanity of other people, and hearing from classroom teachers that, you know, my students had never, I think about Amal Unbound, my students didn't even know Pakistan was a country, for example, or, you know, Padma Venkatraman's book, right? Like The Bridge Home, where kids were like, my students were like, I didn't even know that there were that many street children living in India. What can we do to help? Or the year that the service project was building a library for a small community center in Guatemala. And the Global Read Aloud community came around and did that. And so I think what I've learned in this project is that every book has been magical in some way to the people who have chosen it. And it speaks to the love that educators bring to the global read aloud. Because I may have created it and put the idea out there and done all the behind the scenes stuff, but the magic happens in the hands of educators who sit down and commit to the read aloud and bring it to their kids and then make it their own book. So there's so many stories of all these books. So all of them have been incredible.
Right. So maybe an unfair question, but a beautiful answer. So it worked out. But so cool. So authors sometimes get involved. How does that work? Is that is including authors part of your overall plan going in each year, or how does that usually come about?
It's not, and I've made that very purposeful because I would never invite an author to have to give up their time for free because it's a free project. I can't offer them any kind of compensation. And sure, like it's been crazy to see that in the last couple of years, like typically the books that are picked for the Global Read Aloud end up on the New York Times bestseller list, whether we are part of it or not. You know, it's amazing to see the book sales boost. But what I do behind the scenes is I always contact the authors. They usually know a couple hours before I make it public. And that's mostly so I can say, hey, by the way, if you are on social media, you may get swamped with people asking you to do things for free. And I always kind of tell them like your involvement is not expected. But if you have space for it, please let me know. I can connect you with authors who in the past have done things, different things. I can also talk to you closer to and see like if there's space for something, maybe you want to run a giveaway for like a Skype visit, or maybe we can do a some sort of live event, which we used to do quite a bit, and then it got a little bit unwieldy and it just got harder to do. And then I just leave that ball in the court of the authors and the creators. And so many of them, they always reply, almost always did they reply, and they're like, this is amazing, thank you so much. And then they're also, you know, very real human beings with deadlines and families and who are also living through a global pandemic. And so I always tell people who sign up, there's no guarantee. If an author decides to be a part of it, what an amazing extra benefit and bonus that is, but it is not at the heart of the project. I think I much more look at when I'm selecting books, obviously, whose identities are represented. Will this appeal to a global audience, not just a North American one? And also book accessibility. You know, can someone in Africa get a copy of the book, whether an ebook or, you know, and I've shipped books to Africa for them to participate, you know, or to places in Asia. And so there's a lot of different factors that go into the selection of the text that people might not see, but author availability is not one of them because I would never expect someone to give away free labor.
Any book recommendations? Anything you've read this summer that you could
Where do I
recommend?
start? Oh my
Well, how
gosh.
about I'll start. I'll start.
You start,
All right.
please.
So, best book I read this summer was Kelly Lloyd Gilbert's "When We Were Infinite." Older teen book, really powerful about friendship groups, mental health. Really impressive. More recently, in younger middle grades book, "Show Me a Sign" by Lazat is the author. Real historical novel. A lot of empathy in there, and a really interesting portrait of a particular place in the early 1800s in America. Really cool book. So both of those I would give a huge shout out to.
So now you're gonna make me pick again. Oh my gosh, there's just been so many. Okay, so a book that I'm so excited for educators to put into their classrooms is Black Boy Joy, the anthology edited by Kwame Mabalia. Even just looking at the cover brings me so much joy. Just short stories centered in Black Boy Joy, and already know that two of the texts in it for sure I'm going to be using as mentor texts in our first narrative unit. So I think that, and it's also a book that translates to all ages. So I'm super excited for that book to be in the world. At the beginning of the summer, I read This Poison Heart I believe it's Cameron Garrett. I may be wrong. Oh, yep. See, I'm wrong. Kaylin Barron. Barron is, and it's a new fantasy series, realistic fantasy or realistic magical realism, and it just was so captivating. Middle school and up, absolutely incredible, and I loved the hero at the center of the story. Another book that I recently finally dug into that I just was blown away with with the storytelling was Healer of the Water Monster by Brian Young, an Indigenous author, once again weaving Indigenous culture and tradition into present day story. And it was realistic fantasy, perfect for upper elementary, but certainly also middle school and up. And then I have to just, I love the book that just came out this week, In the Wild Light by Jeff Setner. Jeff is one of my favorite authors as it is. All of his books are so incredible, but like the magic of this book, and again, like how he cares for his characters set in rural Tennessee. This one has to do with opioid addiction and dreams, and how do you leave this place behind that you see so much value in, but that maybe the rest of the world doesn't see value in order for you to pursue your dreams. His language in it is so incredibly beautiful. It's one of my favorite books of 2021. And I think it's one of those heart books that I'm going to sit with for a really long time. I got to read an early version of it, or an advanced review copy of it. And I took so many screenshots because I was like, oh, I need to use this with my students. Oh my gosh, I need to use this as descriptive language. But also just, it's a book that you want to sit down with and just make space for, and then just allow yourself to be transformed by it. So, and I could go on and on and on, but that's why I have an Instagram, right? Because like that's where I recommend all my books. So it's really just for my own brain to be like, wait, what was that book that was really amazing that for some reason my brain cannot remember right now?
Yeah, and I should mention I'll be in the show notes. I'll be linking your blog and GRA, your Instagram, Twitter, where you're making lots of recommendations. And so many of those books you just mentioned are windows for our students into worlds that they might never consider. And you brought up how this book, In the Wild Light, I think you said, is very relevant issues, hard issues in America today. And I'm just thinking about the explosion of wonderful literature we're going to see from the past couple of years, whether it's about race or it's about the pandemic. How do you, what's your relationship with books and students and then the parent community? And I'm just thinking back, like, it almost seems quaint to think back to when Harry Potter was controversial. But just given everything that's happened, how has maybe the last couple of years evolved your relationship in talking about books with parents who maybe are concerned about what students might be reading?
Well, I think the biggest thing, and it's always been a cornerstone of my teaching and the community we build, is that I'm not the gatekeeper, but that the home adults do have the right to choose what they feel is appropriate or not for their child. And while sometimes I might not agree with what those boundaries are, and we can certainly enter into conversation with that if they're willing, um, I'm not their parent. And so I want to make sure though that my classroom collection, and as well as our incredible librarian Christine also works hard on this as a school in our school library, um, has an invitation to all sorts of stories. And because, especially teaching middle school, where kids are at such profoundly different developmental ages, despite being in the same classroom. I have kids who are still dedicated to playing with toys, who come in looking for really funny, easy, not very mature reads. And then I have kids who are like ready to take on the world, who are maybe ready to dive into opioid addiction or sexual abuse or police brutality or whatever it is. And so I want to make sure that the collections that I invite students into exploring reflect that and reflect the many stages they're at in their reading journey. And so one of the biggest things I believe in is just communication. Next week we have our before school conferences with the home adults, and one of the things they'll be handed is a letter that details kind of the content of our classroom collection, and also reminding them of like, speak to your child about what you feel like they're ready for and make sure they're part of that process. But if they do bring home a book that you don't feel comfortable with, that they chose to read, just send it back, because I'm going to place it back on the shelf because it might be perfect for someone else's child, even if it's not perfect for yours. And then I think it's also just allowing kids to develop. And I talk to kids about that all the time. You know yourself best, so self censor. Even if your best friend says this book is amazing, if you don't feel ready for it, you don't feel ready for it. And then put it back on the shelf. Don't force yourself to read something just because others say that you should. And so I think it just is centered in trust and respect. And again, developing that community of readers where nobody's going to judge me if I pick up a book that's maybe meant for really young elementary versus something that's a lot more mature. I do read or try to read like anything that's labeled 14 and up in our classroom. And there's definitely somewhere I'm like, you know what? I don't feel comfortable putting this in my classroom collection. High school, absolutely. If they brought it into our space, for sure, no problem. But like, I don't feel that most seventh graders, for example, are ready to take on this without like support surrounding the book. And so I'm just really mindful of that. And once in a while, there's a book that I don't recognize as being so mature, and a kid will be like, "Mrs. Ripp, have you read this?" And I'll be like, "No, should I?" "Yes." And then once in a while, I'm like, "Oh, oops, okay, yeah, no, let's pull that off the shelf, right?" Or so I think it just comes down to, again, that development of identity and relationship with those at home to say, I'm not here to indoctrinate your child in any way. I'm here to hopefully welcome them into the journey of many different stories and many different lives. And hopefully they can see our school and classroom collection as an invitation into that.
I think it all just connects back to earlier in our conversation, just the high level thinking skills you're developing in your classroom, really thinking about their reading, thinking about themselves as readers and what they're ready for. Pernille, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed this chat and all the recommendations. Love talking about books. And so I appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for making space for me. I appreciate it.
Big thanks to Pernille Ripp for joining me on the show. I love the transparency she brings to her classroom, the vulnerability, the willingness to ask students what they need and what they think about how she's managing and running and organizing the classroom. As teachers, we're not infallible, and student input in the process is vital. And if you're teaching books, you're reading books in your classroom, take Pernille's advice. Ask the students what they think about how it's going, about the responses you have them writing, or the speed at which you're having them go through the book. That's some really good advice that, as Pernille points out, what brings students into the journey far better than just saying, here's how it is, and here's how it's going to be. All right, as always, I welcome comments and questions on Twitter at BigIdeaEd. Thanks for listening. And check us out next time on What's the Big Idea?